Imagine a land where the skies have refused to give rain, where the earth lies cracked and barren, and every blade of grass has withered. For years, Israel suffered under the unrelenting heat of the sun, and the rivers and streams dried up. But this wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a wake-up call, a divine message. The drought that ravaged the land was God's response to a nation that had lost its way, a nation that had turned from the worship of the one true God to the seductive allure of idols. At the heart of this spiritual crisis was King Ahab, who, alongside his queen Jezebel, introduced and promoted the worship of Baal, the storm god believed to bring rain and fertility to the land. Under their rule, altars to Baal sprang up across Israel, and the people, swayed by fear and promises of prosperity, bowed to this foreign god. They offered sacrifices, performed rituals, and abandoned the commandments of Yahweh. The covenant that once bound Israel to God was all but forgotten. But in the midst of this darkness, a prophet named Elijah stood as a beacon of light. Elijah was no ordinary man. He was a prophet called by God to remind Israel of its true identity, a man whose very name meant, "The Lord is my God." With a heart grieved by the people's rebellion, Elijah carried a message that would shake the nation to its core. Armed only with his faith in the word of God, Elijah stepped forward to confront the idolatry that had taken hold of Israel. Elijah's first act was bold and unyielding. He approached King Ahab with a prophecy that would test the power of Baal. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." With those words, Elijah proclaimed a drought over the land, a drought that would expose Baal's powerlessness and reveal the might of Israel's true God. It was a declaration that struck at the heart of Baal's supposed authority, challenging the very foundation of the people's misplaced faith. For 3 long years, Elijah's prophecy held true. No rain fell, no clouds gathered, and the ground remained parched. The people of Israel found themselves in a desperate situation, as their prayers and sacrifices to Baal went unanswered. Slowly, they began to realize that the God they had trusted could not deliver them, that the promises of Baal were empty. Yet, even as hope dwindled, many clung to the idols they had placed their faith in, unwilling to acknowledge the God who had once saved them. Throughout this time, Elijah remained steadfast, hidden away by God, waiting for the moment when he would be called to act again. He watched from afar as the people wrestled with their doubt and despair, as the land withered under the weight of God's judgment. Elijah knew that the time would come for a confrontation, a moment when the people of Israel would have to choose who they would serve. Finally, after 3 years, God spoke to Elijah once more. The time had come to bring the people back to the truth, to remind them of the God who had carried them through the wilderness, who had delivered them from Egypt, and who had promised to be their God. Elijah was ready to obey, knowing that his mission was not only to confront the false prophets of Baal, but to restore Israel's faith in the one true God. And so, with courage in his heart and fire in his eyes, Elijah returned to Israel and sought out Ahab. He called for a showdown, a contest on Mount Carmel, where the people of Israel would witness once and for all who held the power over heaven and earth. Elijah's words echoed through the land, inviting all of Israel to gather and watch as the true God revealed himself. This was more than a battle between 2 men. It was a battle between 2 beliefs, 2 ways of life, and the souls of an entire nation. Elijah was willing to stand alone against hundreds of prophets, to confront a king and a queen, and to risk his life to prove that the Lord was God. His mission was clear, and the stakes were higher than ever. On Mount Carmel, Elijah would put everything on the line to remind Israel of its covenant, to turn the people's hearts back to the God who had never abandoned them. After 3 years of drought, the tension in Israel was palpable. People were desperate. Crops had failed, and the once fertile land had turned into a wasteland. The people of Israel had prayed, sacrificed, and performed every ritual they could think of to appease Baal. But there was only silence. And in that silence, many had started to wonder if the God they had trusted truly had the power they believed. Then came Elijah, walking into the heart of this desolate nation, his voice carrying with it a bold challenge that would echo through the ages. He went directly to Ahab, the king who had fostered Baal worship in Israel, and issued a declaration that stunned everyone. "Summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." This was more than a challenge. It was an invitation for the people to witness a showdown that would settle the matter once and for all. Elijah was calling for a public confrontation, a contest of power between himself, the lone prophet of the Lord, and hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah. Ahab, driven by anger but also a hint of curiosity, agreed to Elijah's terms. He commanded the people to gather, along with the prophets, and make the journey to Mount Carmel. As word spread, people from every corner of Israel began making their way to the mountain. The anticipation grew as they climbed, eager to see what would happen at the top. They were caught between two worlds, two beliefs, and they wanted to know which God would answer. The journey up the mountain wasn't just a physical climb. It was a journey of the soul for each of them, a chance to witness the power that could decide their nation's fate. When the people finally arrived, they saw Elijah standing alone against the hundreds of prophets of Baal. He didn't waver. His posture was resolute, his gaze unwavering. As he looked out over the crowd, Elijah raised his voice and posed a question that pierced through the doubt and indecision that had plagued Israel. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." The people were silent. They had no answer. Elijah's words had struck a chord within them, challenging them to confront the truth they had been avoiding. This was more than a competition. It was a call to choose, a call to commit their hearts to one path. But who would answer? That was the question that lingered in their minds. With the crowd's attention firmly on him, Elijah continued. He proposed a test, one that would be clear, undeniable, and decisive. 2 altars would be built, one for Baal and one for the Lord. Each altar would hold a sacrifice, but no fire would be set. Instead, each side would call upon their God to answer by fire, to consume the sacrifice in front of all of Israel. "The God who answers by fire," Elijah proclaimed, "He is God." The people murmured in agreement, for this test was simple and absolute. They would witness with their own eyes which God held the true power. There would be no trickery, no manipulation, only the raw, undeniable power of the one who could send fire from heaven. The prophets of Baal, confident in their numbers and the power they believed their God possessed, accepted the terms. They moved to build their altar, stacking stones, laying wood, and preparing a bull for sacrifice. The people watched in silence, anticipation mounting with every movement. The showdown was about to begin, and Israel held its breath, wondering which God would answer. Elijah stood aside, calm and patient, knowing that he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing the living God of Israel. He had full confidence that the Lord would answer, not just for his sake, but for the sake of the people who had wandered so far. He knew that what would unfold on Mount Carmel was more than a display of power. It was an invitation for Israel to return to the God who had never abandoned them. As the prophets of Baal prepared, Elijah waited, his faith unwavering. He knew that, in a matter of hours, the question that had plagued Israel would be answered in a way no one could deny. The God of Israel was about to reveal himself, and Mount Carmel would soon be a place of revelation, a place where faith and power would collide in a way that would be remembered for generations. With hundreds of prophets gathered, and the people of Israel watching, the prophets of Baal prepared to call upon their God to answer with fire. They arranged their altar with stones, stacked wood on top, and laid out the sacrificial bull, gathering around in anticipation. The crowd watched as the prophets of Baal took their positions, eager to witness a divine response that would settle, once and for all, the question of who held true power. As the first light of dawn broke over Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal began to call upon their God. "O Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices rising into the still morning air. They raised their hands to the sky, chanting and praying, pleading for Baal to send down fire and consume the offering on the altar. Their chants began as a low hum but soon grew louder and more intense as the hours passed, their desperation rising with the sun. But there was no response. The altar lay untouched, the sacrifice still and silent as though mocking their efforts. As the day wore on, the prophets' determination turned into desperation. They began to dance around the altar, leaping and shouting, trying to capture the attention of their God. Their chants echoed across the mountain, growing louder with every step, every shout. The people of Israel looked on in silence, waiting, but there was only emptiness, a silence that seemed to hang over the altar like a shadow. The prophets of Baal had assured them that their God would answer, that the sacrifice would be consumed in flames. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, the crowd's anticipation turned to skepticism. By noon, the voices of the prophets had grown hoarse, yet still, there was no sign from Baal. The prophets continued their rituals, refusing to give up, determined to force a response from their God. It was then that Elijah, standing calmly on the sidelines, broke his silence. With a hint of humor and bold confidence, he began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." The crowd murmured, watching as Elijah's words stirred a mix of anger and frustration among the prophets of Baal. Emboldened by his taunts, they intensified their efforts. They shouted louder, their voices strained and desperate, pushing themselves to the limit in a final attempt to summon their God. Some of them even resorted to self-harm, cutting themselves with knives and swords until their blood flowed. A common ritual among Baal worshippers meant to display devotion and elicit divine pity. As the prophets cried out, their bodies bloodied and exhausted, a profound sense of futility filled the air. Their actions, meant to summon power, only underscored their own weakness. Their bloodied bodies, their anguished pleas, all painted a stark picture of desperation and failure. The people of Israel, who had once been swayed by these very prophets, began to look on with doubt. The gods they had trusted, the gods they had sacrificed to, remained silent. The hours passed, and still, there was no answer, no fire, no voice, only silence. Elijah remained composed, his faith unshaken, watching the spectacle before him with a steady gaze. He knew that the God he served was not one who needed to be summoned with frantic cries or desperate rituals. The God of Israel was a God who spoke in his own time, who didn't require theatrics or bloodshed to prove his power. Elijah's calmness stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the prophets, a quiet assurance that the true God would indeed reveal himself. By evening, the prophets of Baal were exhausted, defeated. They had done everything within their power, yet the altar remained untouched. Their rituals had amounted to nothing. Their God had been silent, and they were left empty-handed, with nothing to show for their efforts. Their cries had faded, their energy spent, and the silence that hung over Mount Carmel grew heavier, echoing the truth they had tried to deny. Baal had no power here. The people of Israel looked from the weary prophets to Elijah, a shift beginning in their hearts. They had seen the limits of Baal's power, the emptiness of his promises, and now they awaited something more. The stage was set for the true God to reveal himself, to answer the question that had plagued Israel for so long. This wasn't just a test of religious beliefs. It was a revelation, a call for Israel to remember the covenant that had once united them, a reminder that only the God of their fathers had the power to save them. As Elijah stepped forward, he did so with confidence that radiated from a place deep within. His faith, unwavering and steadfast, shone like a beacon against the backdrop of Mount Carmel's growing shadows. He walked with the knowledge that the God he served would answer, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the people who had forgotten him. He wasn't there to prove a point or seek glory. He was there to bring Israel back to the truth, to call them back to a God who had never forsaken them. The prophets of Baal watched in a mixture of dread and disbelief as Elijah took his place before the altar. They had done everything possible to summon their God, every chant, every prayer, every ritual known to them. But nothing had worked, and their failure hung heavy in the air. The people who had once trusted in their words, who had once believed in their promises, now looked on with a growing sense of doubt and anticipation. In their hearts, a question lingered. If Baal was powerless, what about the God of Israel? Could he answer? Would he answer? As the crowd watched, a hush fell over the mountain. The prophets of Baal stood off to the side, broken and defeated, their pride shattered, their influence in tatters. They had tried to call upon their God, but their voices had met only silence. The people turned their gaze toward Elijah, their hearts now open, searching for the truth. They had seen enough of empty promises and powerless rituals. They needed something real, something undeniable. Elijah looked out over the people, his face calm, his heart steady. He knew that what was about to happen would change everything, that the God who had sustained him through drought and solitude would answer once again. And as he prepared to call upon the God of Israel, he knew that this was more than a contest. It was a call to faith, a call to return to the one true God. In the gathering darkness, Elijah's faith shone brightly, a reminder to all who watched that the Lord, indeed, was God. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Mount Carmel, Elijah stepped forward, calm and resolute. The prophets of Baal were weary, defeated, and the silence that had followed their cries lingered heavily in the air. The people watched with anticipation as Elijah, the lone prophet of the Lord, prepared to call upon his God. Elijah began by gathering 12 stones, each representing one of the 12 tribes of Israel. With careful precision, he placed each stone, restoring what had once been broken and lost. Each stone held significance, a reminder of the covenant that had bound Israel together as God's chosen people. With every stone he laid, Elijah was inviting Israel to remember their identity, to see themselves as God had seen them, a people set apart, cherished, and loved. He was calling them back to the roots of their faith, to the God who had called them out of Egypt and led them through the wilderness. When the altar was complete, Elijah began to arrange the wood, placing it with reverence and care. Then, he took the sacrificial bull and laid it on top of the wood, preparing the offering. But he didn't stop there. In a bold and unexpected move, Elijah took the challenge to an entirely new level. He turned to the people and issued a strange command. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. The crowd was puzzled, murmurs rippling through them. Water? In a time of drought? Every drop was precious, and yet here was Elijah asking them to waste it on an altar. Some must have thought him reckless, even arrogant, for making such a demand. But Elijah's confidence was unwavering. He knew that this act would demonstrate the power of God in a way no one could deny. The people obeyed, bringing jars of water and pouring them over the sacrifice until the wood was thoroughly drenched. But Elijah wasn't done. He spoke again, "Do it a second time." More water was brought, and once again it cascaded over the altar, soaking the wood, the stones, and the offering. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and the water began to pool around the base of the altar. Yet still, Elijah had more in mind. He raised his hand and commanded, "Do it a third time." The people complied, and soon water ran down the altar, filling a trench that Elijah had dug around it. The wood, the stones, the sacrifice, everything was soaked, glistening in the last light of the day. Elijah had left no room for doubt. By saturating the altar, he ensured that no natural fire could consume this sacrifice. It would take something extraordinary, something divine, to ignite a fire on that drenched altar. This wasn't just an act of preparation, it was a declaration of faith, a proclamation that the God of Israel was not limited by human conditions or circumstances. This act was a bold statement, a challenge to all who doubted. Elijah was showing Israel that their God was one who transcended the impossible. With the altar prepared and dripping with water, Elijah took a step back, lifting his hands and his heart to heaven. He didn't need to shout or make a show of his prayer. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his God intimately. His voice was steady, filled with reverence. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed, "let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." It was a simple prayer, yet it carried the weight of generations, the promises and covenants made long ago. Elijah wasn't asking for a spectacle. He was asking for a revelation. His words were filled with humility, an understanding that this moment was not about his own glory, but about the glory of God. This was a prayer for Israel, a plea that the people would see, believe, and return to the God who loved them. As Elijah's prayer echoed across the mountaintop, a deep, profound silence fell over the crowd. The prophets of Baal, defeated and humiliated, looked on in disbelief. The people of Israel waited, their eyes fixed on the altar, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very heavens were holding their breath. Elijah's words hung in the air, a plea that resonated with the hearts of those who had forgotten their God, a call to remember the one who had never abandoned them. Elijah stepped back from the altar, his gaze steady, his faith unshaken. He had done all he could. Now it was in God's hands. He knew that the Lord would answer, that the God of Israel was not a distant deity but a living presence, a power that transcended human limitations. Elijah stood there, a single figure on the mountaintop, waiting, knowing that the God who had sent him would not leave him abandoned. This was not a moment for doubt, it was a moment of complete and total faith. The stage was set, the altar was ready, drenched and waiting. The people of Israel held their breath, every eye fixed on Elijah, every heart poised on the edge of belief and doubt. In this moment, time seemed to stand still. The silence was electric, charged with the anticipation of a miracle, the hope of a people desperate for truth. As the shadows lengthened and the sky darkened, Elijah stood resolute, a living testament to faith. He had made a spectacle of his preparation, not for the sake of drama, but to show the people that God's power was about to be revealed in an undeniable way. The water-soaked altar was a challenge, a clear statement that only the true God could answer. Elijah's calmness, his quiet assurance, spoke louder than any shout or cry. In this quiet moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the God of Israel was about to reveal himself in a way that no one would ever forget. Elijah's faith, his unwavering belief, would soon be rewarded, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of an entire nation. The crowd stood in absolute silence, eyes fixed on Elijah's altar, hearts pounding in anticipation. The prophets of Baal, exhausted and defeated, looked on, knowing that they had failed. But Elijah's faith was unshaken. He stood before the altar, waiting, knowing that the God of Israel would answer, that this moment was ordained to reveal his power and turn the hearts of the people back to him. And then it happened. In an instant, the sky, which had been so still, suddenly erupted with a blaze of light. Fire descended from heaven like a blazing torrent, swift and unstoppable. It struck the altar with a force that stunned everyone, consuming not only the sacrifice but the wood, the stones, and even the water that filled the trench. The heat was intense, undeniable, a holy fire that left no trace of doubt. Every element on the altar was reduced to ash in an instant, as though the earth itself bowed in submission to the power of the Almighty. The crowd gasped, some shielding their faces from the brightness, others falling to their knees. This was no ordinary fire. It wasn't a spark or a flicker. It was a consuming blaze, a divine response that silenced every question, every doubt. The people of Israel were witnessing the hand of God, seeing with their own eyes a power that could not be explained away. The fire that had come down from heaven was a proclamation, a declaration that the God of Israel was not just a story from their past, but the living, breathing God who still watched over them. In the stunned silence that followed, Elijah stood firm, his heart filled with gratitude and reverence. He had prayed, and God had answered, not just for his sake, but for the sake of the people who had wandered so far. This fire was not merely a display of power. It was an invitation, a call for Israel to remember the God who had carried them through the wilderness, who had fought for them, who had loved them with an unyielding love. The people, overwhelmed by what they had seen, fell to the ground, their voices rising in unison, crying out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Their words echoed across the mountaintop, a chorus of repentance, a cry of acknowledgement. In that moment, they realized the truth. They had been deceived, led astray by false promises, but the God of Israel had never abandoned them. The fire that consumed the altar was a reminder of His power and His mercy, an invitation to return to the covenant they had once embraced. The prophets of Baal, watching in horror, were left speechless. Their power, their influence, everything they had built was shattered in an instant. Their God had remained silent, and their rituals had been exposed as empty and powerless. They could offer no defense, no justification, for the silence that had met their cries. The people who had once trusted them now turned away, their faith redirected to the one true God who had answered with fire. Elijah, seeing the people's response, knew that this was more than a victory. It was a turning point. Israel, a nation that had wandered and wavered, was being called back to the Lord. The fire on Mount Carmel was more than just a miraculous event. It was a moment of revival, a rekindling of a relationship that had been fractured by doubt and idolatry. As the echoes of "the Lord, He is God" faded, Elijah commanded the people to seize the prophets of Baal, ensuring that their influence would no longer lead Israel astray. This wasn't just a victory over false gods, it was a cleansing, a reclaiming of the land for the Lord. The people, united in purpose, obeyed, realizing that the time had come to turn fully to the God who had never ceased to love them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mountain in shadow, the people descended from Mount Carmel, forever changed. They had seen the hand of God, felt His presence, and been reminded of a power that transcends all earthly gods. The drought would soon end, rain would return, but the greatest miracle of that day was the revival of a nation's faith. The story of Mount Carmel would live on, a reminder for generations that the Lord is not silent, that He answers the prayers of the faithful, and that He alone is worthy of worship. For Elijah, this moment was a testament to God's faithfulness. A victory that proved that when we call on the Lord with a heart of faith, He will answer in ways beyond our imagination. With the prophets of Baal defeated, Elijah knew that there was one final promise to fulfill. The drought, which had afflicted Israel for 3 years, was about to end. Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, where he knelt to pray. Bowing low, his face to the ground, he sought the Lord once more, asking for the blessing of rain to return to the land. The people watched, hopeful yet uncertain, as Elijah's quiet faith continued to unfold before their eyes. After his first prayer, Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea. The servant returned, saying, "There is nothing there." 6 more times Elijah prayed, each time sending his servant to look for any sign of rain. 6 times there was nothing, yet Elijah did not waver. He knew that the God who had answered with fire would answer again with rain. Elijah's persistence was a testament to his faith, a reminder that sometimes God's answers require patient waiting and unwavering belief. Finally, on the 7th time, the servant returned with a different report. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea," he said. It was a tiny, almost insignificant sight, yet Elijah's face lit up with hope. He recognized this small cloud as the beginning of God's promise fulfilled. Turning to his servant, Elijah instructed, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." As the minutes passed, that small cloud grew larger, darker, and soon the sky was filled with heavy clouds, gathering with intensity. A wind began to blow, rustling through the trees, and the scent of rain filled the air. And then, finally, after years of drought, the heavens opened, releasing a downpour upon the parched land. The rain fell in torrents, soaking the earth, replenishing the rivers, and breathing life back into Israel. The people rejoiced, their hearts overflowing with gratitude, for they knew that this rain was not just water, it was a blessing, a sign of God's restored favor upon His people. As the rain fell, Elijah's mission on Mount Carmel was complete. He had stood alone against hundreds, called down fire from heaven, and prayed for rain to end a devastating drought. His faith, unyielding and courageous, had reminded Israel of who they were and whom they served. The people of Israel, who had once wavered between 2 opinions, had now seen the power of the living God, the one who answers by fire and by rain. King Ahab, witnessing all of this, was forced to confront the truth of God's power, though his heart remained hardened. As the rain continued to fall, Elijah, strengthened by the Spirit of God, ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel, demonstrating a strength that could only come from divine empowerment. This final act underscored the supernatural presence that had marked every step of Elijah's journey on that fateful day. The showdown on Mount Carmel was more than just a confrontation between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. It was a turning point in Israel's history. It was a reminder that God's love and mercy remain, even when His people have gone astray. The fire and rain were symbols of God's judgment and blessing, of His power to cleanse and His desire to restore. For Elijah, this victory was a testament to the power of faith and obedience, a reminder that when we stand with God, we are never truly alone. The people of Israel would carry the memory of Mount Carmel with them, a story passed down through generations, a reminder that the Lord alone is God, that He answers those who call upon Him, and that His faithfulness endures through every trial. Elijah's courage and trust became a legacy of faith, inspiring all who would hear the story of the prophet who called down fire and prayed for rain. In every storm, in every season of drought, the people could look back on this moment and remember the God who sees, who answers, and who restores. And that's the unforgettable story of Elijah's showdown on Mount Carmel, a powerful reminder that when we place our faith in God, He will show up in ways beyond our imagination. If this story inspired you, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, share it with anyone who needs a reminder of faith's power, and hit that subscribe button for more stories of courage, miracles, and divine purpose. Thank you for watching, and remember, faith isn't just believing, it's knowing that God stands with us even when we're facing mountains.